Chapter 10. Jocelyn Godet. September 17th, 1959. Jocelyn Godet was a pretty 13-year-old with hair and ringlets. She was the first of the children to testify. She snuggled into the witness stand at the trial. She looked up fleetingly and locked eyes with Stephen. Quickly, they both looked elsewhere. With Jocelyn on the witness stand, Steve felt anger rise in him. He could understand why police had questioned Lynn's classmates. Everyone had done what they could to help when Lynn went missing. What he could not understand was why the police had twisted those words to make him look guilty. What baffled him even more was why Jocelyn had lied. In July, at the preliminary hearing, her lies were crucial to the decision to put Stephen on trial. Now, however, her lies could be a matter of life and death. Stephen's life. Surely this time she would see this was very serious and stop lying. Wouldn't she? Jocelyn smirked and tossed her head and would not look at him again. The judge leaned forward and on the bench. "How old are you?" he asked Jocelyn. 13. "Do you go to school?" "Yes, sir." "What grade are you in?" "Grade 8, Jocelyn answered. Judge Ferguson looked over his glasses at the girl. "Well, what does it mean to take an oath?" Jocelyn looked flushed. "Well, you are not supposed to tell lies." The judge looked relieved. He straightened up. "You understand that, do you?" Jocelyn nodded. "I think she's old enough to be sworn," said the judge. The register held the Bible out to Jocelyn. "Place your right hand on the Bible." Jocelyn did so. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." The clerk retreated. Crown Attorney Hayes rose to his feet. "Jocelyn, last spring, were you in the same grade 7 at the school as Lynn Harper and Stephen Truscott?" "Yes, sir." "And on Monday, June 8th, Jocelyn, did you have a conversation at school with Stephen Truscott?" "Yes, sir." "Will you tell what that conversation was, please?" "Well, on Sunday, I had gone to Bob Lawson's barn, and I had seen a calf there. I mentioned that to Steve on Monday, and he asked me if I wanted to see 2 more newborn calves." "Go on, please." "And I said yes, and he asked me if I could make it on Monday, and I said no, because I had to go to Guides." "Make what?" asked Hayes. If I could go with him to see the calves, and I said no. And then he asked me if I could make it on Tuesday, and I said I would try. On Tuesday, he told me if I could go, and I just told him that I didn't know." She paused. The courtroom fell silent. "And he said to meet him on the right-hand side of the country road, just outside the fence by the woods. He kept telling me not to tell anybody because Bob didn't like a whole bunch of kids on his property." The meeting place she described was where the country road met the tractor trail, only 90 meters or so from where Lynn's body was found. "I got out of the house about 20 after 6 or 6:30, and then I went towards over to Bob Lawson's barn, and I asked him." Crown Attorney Hayes interrupted. "No, what did you go to Bob Lawson's barn for?" "To see if Steve was there." "And after you left the barn, where did you go?" asked Hayes. "To see if Steve was at the meeting place." "I take it you didn't see Steve?" "No." "And then where did you go?" Jocelyn replied. "I went towards the river. I just bicycled. I saw Philip Burns." "And where did you go then?" "There's a sort of a trailer or tractor road or something, and I turned down that and went 3/4 of the way in. I looked toward the railway bridge, and I shouted Steve's name twice. Then I looked toward the woods and shouted it 3 or 4 times. When I looked up, I saw Arnold George going past." "And then what did you do?" asked Hayes. "I got out of the lane, and then I went down towards the river." "Where did you go down there for, Jocelyn?" "I just went down to see if Steve would be at the river," Jocelyn replied. "And was he?" "Well, I didn't see him." "And what did you do after that?" "I stayed there for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I went back to Bob's farm." "Did you see Steve any time that night?" "No." "Did you see Lynn Harper any time that night?" "Not after 5 o'clock, I didn't." A few minutes later, Crown Attorney Hayes asked Jocelyn what time she returned to Bob Lawson's farm. "A little before 7. "How long did you stay there?" About an hour and a half." After Jocelyn's testimony, Donnelly cross-examined her, in particular about the 2 visits to Lawson's barn that evening. In doing so, he failed to point out the time discrepancies in her story. She was out by 30 to 40 minutes. "What was he doing when you got there first?" "He was feeding the pigs." "And when you came back, what he was doing?" "I didn't notice. I just went in and talked to him." "What was he doing?" "Work," Jocelyn replied. "What kind of work?" He let the cows out of the barn, and then he cleaned the barn a little and fed the calf and did jobs like that. And you stayed for an hour and a half? About that. And you were back to Lawson sometime before 7 o'clock? 10 to 7? Yes, sir. Donnelly might have deflated her story if he had known that in her first statement, Jocelyn said she had been looking for Lynn Harper. On June 12th, she told Constable Tremblay that she had walked with her bicycle along the tractor trail to the corner where the bush extends to the north again, around 200 meters from the road. At the preliminary hearing, she altered this, saying, the police, they had a stake there where the bicycle marks were. I went about that far, and then I turned my bicycle and went up the country road again. By the trial, this was amended again. I turned down the tractor trail and went 3/4 of the way in. In only a few days, she had made 3 different statements to police and seemed to have no trouble adjusting her story from time to time. Steve was angry. Jocelyn's story was meaningless. If Jocelyn was back at Lawson's barn before 7 p.m., of course she would not have seen him. He didn't meet Lynn until after 7 p.m., and they didn't leave the school until almost 7:30. He hoped the jury would see the confusion in the lies. Chapter 11. Arnold Butch George. September 17th, 1959. Butch George had been one of Steve's best friends, but his testimony at the preliminary hearing in July had been damning, and enough to send the case to trial. As Butch came to the stand, Steve wondered, would this story be the same? Butch had a history of making things up. Whatever story you want to hear, Butch could usually provide it. That was good when fooling around with the guys, but not in a courtroom. At the preliminary trial in July, Butch had seemed to remember bits of one conversation and bits of another. Then he had patched them together to form a new story. Butch took his place in the witness box and was sworn in, but not before he startled the judge. Do you know what happens to people when they don't tell the truth? Asked Judge Ferguson. My dad told me something about that, and I forgot now. Judge Ferguson sat up. You forgot? The judge looked puzzled. He turned to Crown Attorney Hayes. All right, do you want this boy sworn, Mr. Hayes? If your lordship feels it is important whether they are sworn or not, he doesn't seem to appreciate quite the nature of an oath and what the consequences are. Hayes was now in a bind. A sworn witness could be believed. An unsworn witness could only support testimony from a sworn witness. It was an important difference. I would like to see him sworn, my lord, if he can be, but it is discretionary. Now the judge had a decision to make. He looked down at Butch. Do you go to church, young man? Well, not regularly. The judge sighed impatiently. He turned to the court register. Age 13, he should be able to understand these things. I think you better swear him. After some preliminary questions, Crown Attorney Hayes asked Butch about his meeting with Jocelyn that evening. He'd been biking north on the country road to the swimming hole when he saw Jocelyn on the tractor trail. And you did meet Jocelyn Godet near where? Asked Hayes. The side of the woods. Butch replied. The side nearest the river. Where was she? She was about 40 feet from the road, back in towards the bush there on the lane. Which direction was she going? Towards me. And what time do you say this was, Arnold, that you met Jocelyn there? Butch replied, about 20 minutes after 7. But Jocelyn had said she'd returned to the Lawson barn about 10 minutes before 7 o'clock. Their times were out by half an hour. And where did you go from there? I cut down along the river there to the swimming hole, and I went swimming with these boys. Well, first of all, I stopped. Jocelyn shouted back to me, and she said, the judge stopped Butch. Court rules did not allow witnesses to repeat what others had said. Witnesses could state only what they themselves had asked or said, unless the conversation took place with the accused present, in this case, Stephen. Where was Jocelyn at that time? Asked Hayes. She was at the parking lot, about where the parking lot is. Was she on foot or on bicycle? Butch paused for a moment. It's hard to tell. I didn't notice her. I just heard her, and I looked back, and she asked me if I had seen Steve. Butch said he had stayed at the swimming hole until about 8:30 p.m., and then went home. At no time did he see Lynn Harper that evening. Once he got home, however, he left to see Steve. Hayes asked, You went down to Steve's place? Yes. Steve made fists of his hands and held on tight. He was lying. Butch was lying. What time was that? That was about 8:45. And did you have a conversation with him? I asked him where he'd been that night, and he said, down at the river. I said, I heard that you had given Lynn a ride to the river, and he said, yes. She wanted a lift down to number 8 highway, and I said, I heard you were in the bush with her, and he said, "No, we were on the side of the bush looking for a cow and a calf." And he said, "Why do you want to know for?" And I said, "Skip it and let's play ball." Lies, lies, lies. Steve pressed his lips together. Butch would not look at him. A few minutes later, Butch remembered another conversation. "When was that?" asked Hayes. "It was in the evening, I think." "Wednesday, June 10th, then?" By means yes, does it? "Yes," said Butch. "And what was said on that occasion?" Butch didn't seem to know where to look. "Well, he said that the police had questioned him, and that he had told them he had seen me," Butch said. "But it wasn't me, it was Gordy Logan. He thought that Gordy was me, so he told the police that. He said that the police were going to go down to my place to check up, so I agreed that I would tell them I had seen Steve." In other words, Butch said, he had agreed to lie to the police because Steve had asked him to. Whatever the cause of this confusion, it made Stephen look guilty. Butch also said he and Stephen had joined several others on the bridge on June 10th. That was the day after Lynn went missing and the day before her body was found. About that conversation, Hayes asked, "Now, what was it you said, Arnold?" "Well, Paul," Desjardins said to Steve, "I heard you had Lynn up in the bush with you." And he said, "No, I didn't. Did I, Butch?" And I said, "No, he had her at the side of the bush." "Repeat that." "You had her at the side of the bush looking for a cow and a calf." "Who said that?" "Me." When Frank Donnelly rose to begin his cross-examination of Butch George, he had what should have been an easy job, to show that Butch's word was not reliable. Donnelly asked Butch to think back to the evening when Lynn was last seen. "Had he been looking for Steve?" Donnelly asked. "Yes." "At any time, from the time you started to look for him until you found him at his home at 9 o'clock that evening, did you see him anywhere?" "No, sir." "Did you see his bicycle anywhere?" Steve's bicycle was unique, an English 3-speed racing bike with 10 colored tassels, each almost a foot long, attached at each handle. It would be hard to miss. "No." "And if this bicycle had been laying along the road along Lawson's Bush, you would have seen it, wouldn't you?" "Yes." "And when you stopped to talk to Jocelyn Goudet, were you about opposite the laneway running along the north side of the bush?" "Yes." "And she was in, you said, about 40 feet?" "Yes." "And could you see along the north side of the bush from some distance?" "Yes." "And did you see that bicycle lying alongside of the north side of the bush?" "No." Donnelly did challenge Butch on the conflict with his testimony at the preliminary hearing. He read from the transcript of that hearing. Butch had then described his meeting at Steve's house on June 9th, but had not mentioned the story of the calf and cow. "Those answers were true?" he asked. "Yes," replied Butch. Donnelly straightened up, the transcript still in his hand. He looked over his glasses at the boy. "And at that time, you said nothing about Truscott having mentioned of being at the side of the bush looking for a cow and a calf." "I suggest that wasn't said on that occasion at all. If it was said at any time, it was down at the bridge. He said it that night when I was up at his house." But Butch didn't sound quite sure. Steve gripped his chair. Butch was lying. He had never come to the house that night. "Why didn't you tell us that? You told us in July what he said, and you didn't tell us that then." "I forgot." It was a great fet of forgetting. Years later, Butch's statements to police would reveal what police and the Crown knew at the trial, that Butch had offered the story about Steve taking Lynn Harper to look for calves before anyone knew Lynn was missing. Shortly after Butch returned from the swimming hole, he had told friends that Steve had taken Lynn into the woods. At the same time, he admitted he had not witnessed this, and at the time had neither seen nor talked to Steve. Donnelly didn't know that, but even so, he pressed to clarify. "Your memory would be a whole lot better 2 months ago than it would be today, wouldn't it?" "Well, I stated that statement while I was during that time." Usually, lawyers never ask questions to which they don't know the answer. This avoids unexpected answers. But now, Donnelly sensed an opening. Had the police provided information that improved his memory? Donnelly asked. Finally, Butch said, "Well, parts of my statement had been lost, and they gave me another sheet." "When?" 2 weeks ago." Steve glared at his former friend. Donnelly continued. "And how often did you read that over before you came to court?" "About 10 times." 10 times? You memorized the sheet that was given to you, did you?" "I wasn't trying to memorize it." "Why were you going over it so often?" "Trying to make sure what I said, what I was going to say." Finally, Donnelly tried to clarify. You never did see Steve at the side of the woods, did you? No. And you don't know whether Steve saw you down at the river or not, do you? Butch didn't answer. Now, how many statements did you give to police? 3. And they were all different, weren't they? The first 2 were. So you gave 3 statements. Yes. And they were all different. Yes. Was this sheet that was given to you 2 weeks ago from the first, second, or third statement? The third. Before he left the witness stand, Butch George appeared confused about whether he had talked to the police or his friends first on Wednesday night or Tuesday night. Even so, one statement must be struck with the jury. When the body was found, he said, I changed my story.